So it's actually been a few months now since I last did a video to update you, my viewers and subscribers, on the current status of Washington State's campaign for our next governor here in 2024. Now, I noticed that there was actually a bit of viewer traffic to my last video, which I produced on this topic back in August of last year, which is kind of now a bit dated quite a bit. So I wanted to just make sure that you had some fresher and more up-to-date information to go on. So let's just get to where the 2024 race and campaign for Washington State's governor actually stands today. Now, first of all, there are only 4 serious candidates that are running for this office at this time. And frankly, we're unlikely to see any last-minute surprises with just a last-minute dark horse candidate jumping in at the last minute. Although that could theoretically still happen, it's just unlikely for a variety of reasons, mainly having to do with fundraising, logistics of campaigning, endorsements that are already committed, and then other very practical considerations. Beyond those issues, there's also the fact that every candidate needs to officially file for office with the Secretary of State by the second week of May. May 10th is officially the last day that you can file for office and then still be on the ballot for the August primary election. Now, that time constraint effectively closes the door to any serious candidate appearing after May 10th. So let's chat about these 4 candidates likely to be on the ballot. There are 2 who identify as Democrats, currently Attorney General Bob Ferguson and 5th Legislative District State Senator Mark Mullet. Now, the 5th Legislative District encompasses Issaquah, for those of you who just don't have your Washington State Legislative District geography memorized, and who would. But on the Republican side of the political spectrum, there's actually Dave Reichert. He's the former district congressman, 8th District congressman, and the former King County Sheriff. And we also have former Richland School Board Director Semi Bird, who is actually campaigning from the Tri-Cities in eastern Washington, and who I've actually been able to interview a few months ago for my regular viewers. Now, if you want to pay attention to who is running for office, I greatly encourage you to become familiar with Washington State's Public Disclosure Commission. You can actually go here at pdc.wa.gov, and if you click on the For Voters and the Public, and then you click on the box Political Disclosure Reports, and then you click on Candidates, and you can type in 2024 election and then governor. And you're going to see then all the candidates who have filed to run for governor with the Public Disclosure Commission. Now, legally, every candidate who announces that they're actually running for office in a statewide or local position in Washington State, they need to actually file their campaign information with the Public Disclosure Commission within a few weeks of their official announcement. So this can actually be confusing to some, because this doesn't mean that they're absolutely going to be on the ballot just because they file with the Public Disclosure Commission. These candidates will need to formally file again with the Secretary of State, and they have to pay it's almost $2,000 in filing fees. It's basically the equivalent of 1% of the salary of the office that they're seeking. So that extra step does tend to bounce out the unserious candidates who are currently filed with the PDC, but doing nothing to essentially move their campaigns along. Now, for example, there are currently 29 candidates who have officially filed their campaign information with the PDC. You can see them yourself when you go look on the website. But I'd predict that many of them drop out of the race before the May deadline. In the meantime, you can actually learn a tremendous amount about the candidates just by paying attention to these actual PDC reports themselves. Now, right away, you're going to notice that only 7 of the listed candidates have raised any serious amount of money for this office. And I'll define serious as, say, more than $400,000, which is a fraction, of course, of what they're going to need if they're going to seriously run for this position. Now, the amount of money, it matters, because if they raise no money, nobody's going to know who they are, because they'll have no practical way to market themselves to the, almost 5 million potential voters in Washington State. Now, people often ask me why the money matters and why it matters so much. And the answer is just marketing 101. If you can't let people know that you're running for office and why you're so great, well, people just aren't going to know that they should vote for you. You do have to ask people for their vote. It really is just that simple. And it isn't an evil conspiracy, but it is a very practical metric to figure out how serious or capable a candidate and their campaign team really is. Now, remember when I told you that there were only 4 serious candidates a few minutes ago, but I just told you that 7 of these candidates had raised over $400,000 at least. But what about the other three, you might ask? Well, two of them, Jay Inslee and Hillary Franz right here, have officially dropped out of this race, and they've actually transferred their funds out of their former governor campaigns. Current Governor Jay Inslee has decided that 3 terms are enough. He's done all the damage he hoped to inflict on our state, and now he's just busy feathering his post-governor career path, probably at some cushy job next year. Now, the current Washington State Public Lands Commissioner, Hillary Franz, who was dusting it up with Ferguson just a few months ago, has actually given up, surrendered, and decided to shift her focus from the governor's race, which is really the same thing that she did in her aborted effort to run for governor back in 2020 as well. And then now, instead, she's actually running for the 6th Congressional District, which is a position out on the Olympic Peninsula, and it's an open seat and kind of becoming just another free-for-all congressional race in Washington State. Now that leaves us with 5 candidates. One of them I don't count because it appears to be some Spokane Valley candidate named Cassandra Magdalene Hansen, with no party affiliation and who has filed such botched and weird campaign finance reports. She's either trying to make a mockery of the state's campaign finance laws, which I can actually respect just for epic trolling aspect of it, or she's just running a money laundering operation, or she's just so screwed up with her unbelievable and ridiculous campaign finance filings that the PDC is going to have to take months during their investigation of her campaign to actually figure out what exactly is going on here. I actually filed a complaint against this campaign last week, and I believe it posted just a few days ago. So I hope it's really just an epic troll rather than a criminal enterprise. But we will see. Okay, so let's get back to the 4 serious candidates that are actually running for Washington State's next governor. The front runner, unfortunately, is Washington State's Attorney General Bob Ferguson. Now, right now, he reports having over $6 million in the bank for his campaign, and I'd expect that he ends up raising at least $15 million, probably before the primary campaign in August. His ability to extract cash from his donors is really his biggest strength in this race. And with Franz dropping out, the hard left really has no other choice. Ferguson is basically a Democrat, maybe a socialist, and as a statewide office holder who has been elected 3 times statewide already, he has an obvious advantage over all the challengers. And it looks like the billionaire class of Democrat donors are going to certainly support him. However, he also has some clear and obvious weaknesses, and these he's actually struggling to overcome. First of all, Ferguson doesn't have as much name recognition as people might think, and most of his name recognition is not positive. He has generated a lot of negative attention, partly due to his draconian and then very hyper-partisan aggressive enforcement of Inslee's lockdown executive orders a few years ago. Also, his weird and then bizarre targeting of Value Village, for example. Just a case in which he not only lost, but he cost the taxpayers a lot of extra money for this malicious prosecution. And under Ferguson's leadership, the state's Attorney General's office has also cost the taxpayers hundreds of thousands of dollars in settlements due to repeatedly destroying or attempting to conceal public records from the people. Ferguson has certainly directed the AG's office into kind of a dark and secretive place, destroying public records and concealing the truth from the public often enough that this pattern of behavior is going to be tough to miss for anybody unless you happen to work for King 5 News. Now, Bob Ferguson has also generated a very strong reputation as a pro-criminal and pro-crime wave attorney general, who, at best, he just looks the other way when public safety is at stake. Remember the riots, the Chaz Chop debacle in Seattle, and then the radical increase in violent crime, drug cartels, and then other escalating violence just across the board in Washington State. Bob Ferguson is nowhere to be found. On the other hand, Ferguson did involve himself in aggressively releasing violent sex predators into neighborhoods while colluding to keep his support of this program secret from the families that he exposed to this violence. He also actively engaged to ensure that drug cartels could maintain their operations in homeless drug addict camps in Lacey, Olympia, and of course elsewhere around the state. At the same time, Ferguson's office repeatedly played partisan small ball by just unleashing the entire force of the state against the little people who essentially couldn't fight back. He attacks florists in the Tri-Cities, small businesses in Lewis County and throughout the state, and then activists like Tim Eyman, all while ignoring real crime constantly. This is all he seems to have done. Now, Ferguson right now is acutely aware of the public perception about his pro-crime actions and his position, so he's actually been struggling lately to pretend that he cares about the crime wave in the state that he's ignored until now. And recently, he just went on King 5 News and put out his current political talking point that he actually cares about public safety. Now, he chose King 5 News to make this announcement because outside of the Stranger newspaper in Seattle, which just openly worships Bob Ferguson, King 5 News was probably the only guaranteed safe media organization that long ago abandoned journalism as a vocation and instead has structured itself to promote whoever the Democrats tell them to support. So they're never going to challenge Ferguson or even ask him a tough question. He wouldn't be doing this right now if he hadn't conducted numerous polls showing that he's actually underwater and weak on public safety. Now, he will probably be spending millions of dollars over the next few months to hide his pro-crime behavior and recent records of the past. The other Democrat in the race is actually Mark Mullet. He's the state senator from Issaquah who won re-election 4 years ago in the 5th legislative district by only a handful of votes after Governor Inslee came out and then openly supported Mullet's opponent. And Inslee tried to then sabotage Mullet's re-election chances. In 2020, Mullet won only because the Republicans in his district came out and helped him after the primary, because there were 2 Democrats in the top 2 general. So Mullet is understandably bitter about Inslee's backstabbing, and the Democratic Party has largely done everything they can to sabotage his future political aspirations. Now, what is his biggest sin? Now, first, he actually believes math is real, which is no longer an acceptable belief inside the Democratic Party. And he is sometimes familiar with how businesses are run, so he understands that you shouldn't try to destroy them by passing insane and destructive regulation. He remains largely aligned with the Democratic agenda on social issues, although I've heard rumors that he might be capable of knowing what a woman is, which is no longer allowed for Democrat politicians in today's Democratic Party in Washington state. Their orthodoxy will no longer allow that. Now, Mullet has raised over $1 million so far, which makes him a serious candidate for this office. Much of his fundraising has come from Lobby World in Olympia, which kind of makes sense because for the last 12 years or so, they've had to work with Mullet to help kill bad bills or at least water them down a bit. And it's easier to do this with a Democrat willing to listen than using just Republicans who are often locked out of the bill negotiation process. However, in the August primary, Mullet really does have a steep road to climb due to the fact that the voters most likely to vote for him are also pretty likely to vote for a Republican candidate. And when given an opportunity, usually the voters, particularly in a primary, they're going to vote for the candidate that they believe aligns closest to their views. The Democratic Party itself is already in a strong attack mode, undermining Mullet consistently with the Democrat base and their voters. So it isn't clear that many are going to defect from Ferguson and vote for Mullet instead, particularly with a financial disparity of 6-1 on the finance front, and it's likely to get even more lopsided by July when those ballots actually get mailed out. Now, Republicans hope that Mullet can divert enough votes from Ferguson to possibly beat Ferguson in the primary, but that's a long-shot dream, unrealistic at this time unless Ferguson just flounders and fails more than normal between now and July, when the ballots are initially mailed. Now, I first met Mullet in 2010 at a Christmas party in Newcastle when he was actually just on the Issaquah City Council, had just recently been elected, and because we have some mutual friends in common. He's just a very personable, reasonable guy, and the Democratic Party is simply stabbing him in the back because they no longer want people like this in their party. Now, we need to look at the Republican side of the governor campaign, which I realize is more interesting to most of my viewers. The front-runner Republican, money-wise, is no surprise, Dave Reichert, who's the former congressman from the 8th Congressional District and the former King County Sheriff, best known for his arrest of the Green River murderer so many years ago. Now, according to the Public Disclosure Commission, Reichert has raised over $2.1 million by the time I'm actually recording this video. Now, last year, when I produced my second video on the governor's race, I mentioned that Reichert entering this race would seriously impact Mullet's chances in the primary and with donors, and I believe that prediction is actually bearing out right now, as Reichert tends to be getting more obvious support from small donors and businesses. And by the way, it should be no surprise, nor is it a conspiracy, that Reichert is the frontrunner on the Republican side when it comes to fundraising, at least. He has successfully run for Congress many times, and that fundraising experience and past success would most certainly contribute to a successful fundraising effort this time out. He has been retired from political life for the last 5 years, and this is very true, but unless you burned all your contact lists, it's far easier to come out and raise funds when you have experience doing this for decades in the state. Now, the final serious candidate in this race is Semi Bird, who regular viewers will know that I did a rare interview with a primary candidate in this race last year. And as I stated at the time, and I'm also offering to interview Reichert in advance of the primary, but we've actually not been able to set up that interview yet. If viewers want to see that interview with Semi Bird, I've actually linked to it down below. And according to the PDC, the Public Disclosure Commission, the Bird campaign has raised about $411,000 so far, which makes him a serious contender for the governor's seat, but does put him back of the pack on the fundraising side of the equation. Now, Bird was the first candidate to officially file with the Public Disclosure Commission for this office. According to his C1 filing, he started his campaign November 12, 2022, almost 2 years before the 2024 election. The next closest was actually Bob Ferguson, who filed in May of last year, followed by Mullet in early June, and then Reichert in late June of last year in 2023. Now, as I've repeatedly stated, I'm not officially endorsing any candidate in this race, although I will point out that Ferguson is the worst person our state could scrape up to occupy the governor's office. Any just random fentanyl addict pulled off the streets of Seattle would be better than Ferguson, so it's impossible to dredge up a worse candidate than this guy. But I'm not endorsing any candidate specifically. I just don't want Ferguson to destroy our state any more than Inslee has already done. We need to fix problems in our state, not keep destroying it, and that's why I'm basically an anyone but Ferguson person at this point in time. So now let's get into just the practical kind of nitty-gritty of the final series of steps for the anti-Ferguson side of this race for governor. The two Republican candidates for office, Semi Bird and Dave Reichert, will be competing in a few weeks for the official endorsement of the Washington State Republican Party, essentially their PCOs and party activists, at the Washington State Republican Party Convention in April in Spokane. Now, this will be the first time since the top two primary or jungle primary process was kind of forced on our state 20 years ago that the party is going to use the state convention as an endorsement platform for Republican candidates. And they've actually scheduled this convention to be just a few weeks before the May filing deadline with the Secretary of State's office. This is openly and clearly done to help winnow the field down for Republican candidates who have, in recent years, often flooded the zone with candidates and frequently self-immolated during the jungle primary, therefore ensuring that no Republican survives a primary to be on the general ballot in November. Now, if you don't understand Washington State's jungle primary process, I'm going to encourage you to go to my video from years ago. I've actually linked to it down below, and I explain how it works. But the Republicans have repeatedly, with just egregious ego, visions from God, usually for every single person simultaneously in the race, and basically just stupidity diluted their ability to even field a candidate out of the primary for the general election. Recent examples of this include the 2022 Secretary of State race, where 4 Republican candidates diluted the vote and ensured that none of them made it to the general ballot. There was, of course, also the 2022 47th Legislative District House race, where 3 Republican candidates diluted the vote with the same predictable result. We also had the 2020 lieutenant governor race, where 6 Republican geniuses ensured that no Republican could make the general election, and the 2020 10th congressional election, where 8 Republicans mathematically challenged candidates, all but guaranteed the Republicans would not make the November general. And that's just a partial list of these recent jungle primary fiascos. Now, to be fair, the Democrats have done the same thing in, for example, the state treasurer race in 2016. And they might do it again right now with the race for the public lands commissioners, but usually it's typically the Republicans who screw it up like this. So the state Republican Party, after years of frustration and basically debating this idea, they finally implemented a state nomination process at their state convention where the attendees are going to be determining which Republican candidate running for either statewide offices or congressional district races will actually get the formal endorsement. Now, keep in mind, this primarily will help those candidates who get this endorsement with basically formal communication and then just official announcements across the state that they have the endorsement through the August primary by the Republican Party. This doesn't actually prevent those who are not endorsed from still running for office. We have a jungle primary process, so the respective political parties, they really can't stop anyone who wants to run for office under their respective party label from doing so. But this kind of official endorsement process by the Republicans is just one way that the Republican Party is going to try to use and perhaps help persuade the less serious, fled the zone, I had a vision but no money, or real support style candidates, and perhaps convince them that maybe that vision from Jesus you had just maybe wasn't quite what you thought it was at the time. So here's my thoughts on kind of the strengths and just the kind of weaknesses of the respective Republican candidates that are going into this primary process right now. And again, both Republican candidates and the Democrat candidate, Mark Mullet, are the difference between basically just the light and then the evil darkness of Mordor when compared to the dark cloud of Bob Ferguson. I'll take any one of these guys over Ferguson any day, and any sane person should do the same. Now, Semi Bird has been working the Republican conservative grassroots for a long time now, laying his direct voter and basically direct activist contact as kind of a foundation for any political campaign in advance, I believe always helps. He's demonstrated that. If you're very good at retail politics, this is a very wise strategy, and it's one that I've recommended for candidates for many years now. This is no secret. And if you are dedicated in how you spend your time, and you can actually grow quite a base of support without having to spend a lot of money, which Bird clearly has done. However, it also helps if you have adequate funding to communicate to much of the population who will probably be hearing or seeing your name for the very first time when they open their primary ballot in basically, or their voter's guide in July. As most people know, if you're a Republican candidate, you have to know the traditional media will almost basically always ignore you and give you kind of cursory coverage at best. If they're grudgingly forced to write something about your campaign, they're going to primarily disparage, undermine, and attack you. I mean, this is particularly true if you're a non-white guy candidate because of the diversity, inclusion, equity agenda at all the traditional media outlets. Republicans don't really care about the candidate's race or ethnicity. But the lefties and the libs, they're obsessed with that beyond everything else. So they're going to conceal the fact that Semi Bird is a black guy as best as they can. For example, you're going to see that the traditional media, they won't put his photos in their articles if they can avoid it. Unless the media, of course, finds some way to use that fact negatively, of course. Nevertheless, Semi Bird has done a good job working the Lincoln Day dinners for 2 years now, working with school board candidates and activists during Inslee's lockdown world drama when Semi was actually on the Richland School Board. He's very personable, like any good politician, and he speaks comfortably in public. His retail political skills are good. They've been honed now over 2 years, and his opponents ignore or downplay this fact very foolishly. This has allowed him to build up goodwill and local endorsements over time to good effect. Now, here's where the Bird's campaign weaknesses, this is where they exist. It's just reality. First, the fundraising is just not adequate to fund a statewide campaign currently. Now, I'm not making some insightful, radical, and amazing statement here. Bird knows this. If he was sitting right next to me, he'd probably agree. This is just simply a challenge that needs to be overcome if you want to win this race. Even getting the state Republican Party endorsement in April, that isn't enough to overcome the shortfall in cash because most of the funds technically controlled by the state party are often funds allocated to federal congressional races, for example, and they may be restricted by National Republican Party instructions. From what I've seen over the years, the state party rarely is able to actually transfer much in the way of funds, even to statewide candidates, until weeks after the primary election is completed in August. The second challenge that the Bird campaign must address is mostly related to Republican Party infighting and sniping over, scandals and drama and the reactions to these. Now, I've seen this hundreds of times. And this time's really no different. There's nothing new here. And listen, a political campaign is an emotional roller coaster experience. I've been there myself. I really know, and I've seen it firsthand for years now. It takes a lot of self-control to not take the endless attacks very personally and to not lash out at the people you believe are attacking you. Now, most of this infighting is kind of a distraction from the necessary effort that it takes to run a serious political campaign. Now, yes, you do have to respond to your accusations, but you have to do this in a methodical, other side of the story sort of way. I mean, here's the evidence kind of manner. You just can't lash out in anger or frustration because if you do, Political opponents are just going to keep baiting you with more and more claims or accusations and even silly attacks just to get you to waste your time responding and getting personal in your responses. You have to address the accusations, but you have to stay focused on the goal of just winning. I mean, this is basically the advice I give to all candidates in this type of political battle. And then here's actually the reality of basically any campaign facing this kind of a situation. During a contested primary, the infighting and the attacks, they're essentially coming from insiders, activists, and consultants who support your opponent usually. And these are actually the same people that you're actually going to need to approach or to at least ask them to vote for you in the general election, assuming that you get through the primary. And this is a two-way street. This is true for both sides. It doesn't benefit any candidate to lash out at each other during the primary in a personal way because you're going to need to work with these same people in just a few months. This is true regardless of who survives the primary. Now listen, the two campaigns in this case, the Reichert and the Byrd campaign, they're going to be tossing grenades at each other during the primary, and I get this. I've seen it hundreds of times before, and probably you have too. However, it's best to recognize on both sides that at the end of August, you're going to need to find a path to reconcile and some reconciliation maybe in order to focus on saving the state. Now, Reichert, I think, just has a different set of challenges going into the primary election. He enters the Republican race with more name recognition, but mostly name recognition from probably King County and its former 8th congressional seat experience. He has to expand the network of people who know him outside of his comfort zone. And this is obvious. His ability to fundraise places him second overall in the state for the governor's race right at this time. But it's easy to hang out with groups of people who already know you. It is much harder to just expand your reach outside of the donor phone calls and Republican meetings. These are both important, but Reichert's going to have to be comfortable reaching out to the base so that they're willing to help work to get him elected because he's going to need them. The money itself won't be enough, particularly if those funds are spent largely on management and consulting services rather than direct voter contact and outreach. Reichert's law enforcement background is going to serve him well, probably going into a political campaign where public safety, I'm presuming, is going to be top of mind for most voters. It is right now. Now, the smart insider consultant class always views the governor's race as an opportunity to grab for cash. And this is always what we see, election after election. And they've seen candidates come and go, but Republicans won't win a statewide race if they do things the exact same way that they always lose and always have lost in the past. They really won't. I know that's a surprise. I hope that this statement isn't a surprise to you. I mean, successful Republican candidates are going to have to break free of the constraints and predictable failures that their consultants will just want to regurgitate and then send their way. The Reichert campaign will need to control consultant and management spending so that their money just isn't wasted on helping the consultants pay for a new mansion and trip to the Caribbean. Instead, I think these funds must be directed at real voter outreach and contact, probably in some innovative ways that the consultants won't support because they won't be getting their 15% kickbacks that way. Now, Reichert has often said that he came out of retirement to try to fix the problem he sees with the state. And that's obvious, partly because of his age, that basically being governor would be the final swan song of his already lengthy public service. That provides an interesting opportunity for him as a candidate if he can communicate it clearly to the public. A wiser man, the adult in the room kind of perception, and the guy who doesn't need the job but's willing to do the hard work that it's going to take to clean up the mess that's been created by previous politicians. There's actually some version of this message that I think that people can understand, and they just need to hear it from the candidate directly. People must know you care, you are serious, and that you will competently do the job. I think Reichert's challenge, despite his success so far, will actually still be fundraising, just like with Byrd and just like with Mullet, but also how Reichert spends those funds and how he reaches out to the public. Just a hint here, expensive, dumb mailers will not be enough. Now listen, one of these three men, and yes, on this program, we actually know what a man is, and I'll let Ferguson pick his own pronouns when he's actually ready. But one of these three guys right here, they're going to get out of this August primary, and they're going to be facing off with the evil empire that is personified by Bob Ferguson. And may the best man win in August, whether they are on a crusade like Semi Byrd, which I appreciate, or a former sheriff come to clean up the mess like Dave Reichert, or even if they're just a unicorn, a Democrat, maybe the last one, who still believes that math is real, like Mark Mullet. The steps they each take over the next few months are going to determine our choices in November. Now, regardless of who comes through the primary to face off with the Borg or the Ferg, they are all better than Ferguson, way better. But one part of helping them get through August will be your efforts to vote and show up. If you just whine and complain, we don't like our choices, or if we wish that a special dream candidate that doesn't really exist in reality were to show up, and you do nothing about the reality that actually faces us, that's right before us now, then you truly don't matter. And you just surrender your future to others who do bother to show up. Because if you show up to have an impact, to support your candidate, spread the word to others, harvest those ballots, and then make it count, find your niche to have some kind of an impact, then you actually can do something to change the direction of our state. But in the end, it is up to you and I and up to others who show up. Because in the end, as I always say, the future belongs to those who show up.